When Delta Force's most critical training exercise spiraled into chaos, with multiple aircraft screaming toward disaster, everyone turned to the woman they'd spent months calling washed up and dead weight. Master Sergeant Camila Torres had endured every insult, every dismissive glance, every cruel joke about her age and abilities. What none of them knew was that she possessed combat coordination secrets that would not only save their lives, but transform everything they thought they knew about air support operations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The humid Florida air hung thick over Eglin Air Force Base as Master Sergeant Camila Torres stepped off the military transport, her weathered duffel bag slung over her shoulder and determination etched into every line of her face. At 33, she was returning to active duty after a 6-year hiatus that had taken her far from the world of military precision and into the unpredictable chaos of single motherhood. The weight of that transition pressed down on her shoulders like the oppressive Gulf Coast heat. 6 years. That's how long she'd been away from the military, raising her son Diego after her husband was killed in a training accident. Now Diego was a high school senior, independent enough to handle himself, and Camila needed more than the part-time security jobs that had barely kept them afloat. The Joint Terminal Attack Controller Certification Program at Eglin was her pathway back to financial stability, and, more importantly, back to the career that had once defined her entire identity. But as she surveyed the sprawling Special Operations Wing training facility, watching groups of young airmen and soldiers moving with the cocky confidence of those who'd never left the military machine, she wondered if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. The technology had evolved, the procedures had changed, and she felt like a relic trying to fit back into a world that had moved on without her. "Welcome back to the real Air Force, Grandma," a voice called out as she passed a cluster of trainees lounging near the dormitory complex. The comment drew snickers from the group, all of whom looked like they could barely order a beer legally, let alone coordinate close air support for special operations forces. Camila kept walking, her jaw set in a line that Diego would have recognized as her "don't test me" expression. She'd expected this kind of reception, but experiencing it firsthand still stung more than she had anticipated. The JTAC program was notorious for its intensity and its washout rate. Joint Terminal Attack Controllers were the critical link between ground forces and air support, responsible for directing precision strikes that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. It required split-second decision-making, flawless communication skills, and an intimate understanding of both ground tactics and aerial capabilities. The margin for error was 0, and the consequences of mistakes were measured in lives lost. Her bunk assignment placed her in Building 7 with 18 other trainees, and she was immediately struck by how young they all looked. The oldest appeared to be maybe 26, while some looked like they'd graduated high school last month. As she unpacked her gear with the methodical precision that had been drilled into her during her previous military service, she caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. "Seriously? They're letting soccer moms play with million-dollar aircraft now?" One voice stage whispered loud enough to ensure she heard every word. "Probably here for the Instagram photos," another added with cruel amusement. "Someone's going to have to babysit her through basic communication protocols," a third voice chimed in, followed by the kind of laughter that was designed to cut rather than amuse. Captain Nathan Cross, the program's lead instructor, approached her bunk area with a clipboard and an expression that managed to convey both professional courtesy and barely concealed skepticism. He was young for his rank, probably early 30s, with the kind of crisp uniform and perfect posture that suggested he'd never encountered a regulation he couldn't follow to the letter.
"Torres, right?" Cross said, consulting his clipboard with exaggerated care. "Look, I'll be straight with you because I respect your previous service. This program isn't designed for people who've been out of the loop. JTAC operations require instantaneous reactions, physical endurance, and mental agility that, well, let's just say the demands are significant. If you find yourself struggling to keep pace, there's no shame in requesting a transfer to a support role that might be more suitable for your current situation. "I'm here to learn and serve, Captain," Camila replied quietly, continuing to organize her footlocker with movements that were economical and precise. "Same as everyone else." Cross exchanged meaningful glances with Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, his senior enlisted assistant, who'd been hovering nearby with the obvious intention of eavesdropping on the conversation. Webb was a decade younger than Camila, but carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never doubted his place in the military hierarchy. "We'll see about that," Cross said, with a tone that suggested he'd already made his mind about her prospects. "Formation at 0530 tomorrow. Try not to hold back the rest of the class." That first night, as the dormitory filled with the sounds of young soldiers settling into their bunks, conversations about weekend plans, complaints about the heat, boasts about previous training accomplishments, Camila lay awake, staring at the ceiling and questioning every decision that had brought her to this point. Her phone buzzed with a text from Diego, who was working late at his part-time job at a local garage. "How's Air Force school, Mom? Bet you're the smartest one there." She almost laughed at the irony. If Diego only knew what none of these young hotshots suspected, that her mother carried secrets that would have changed their entire perception of her capabilities. 8 years ago, before Diego hit his teenage years and needed more stability, she had been personally selected by Colonel Samuel Thunder Rodriguez, a legendary combat pilot whose precision strike coordination had become the stuff of military legend. Rodriguez had handpicked her from among 120 candidates for an experimental advanced combat coordination program that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in air-ground operations. The program had been so classified that even now, years later, most of its details remained buried in Pentagon files, marked with security classifications that would make career intelligence officers nervous. Rodriguez had made her promise to keep their connection and her advanced training secret unless it was truly necessary to reveal it. "Real expertise doesn't advertise itself," he had told her during one of their intensive late-night training sessions in the Nevada desert. "It waits quietly until the moment when lives depend on it, and then it acts with precision that leaves no room for doubt." As Camila finally began to drift towards sleep, she could almost hear Rodriguez's gravelly voice echoing through her memory. "Speed impresses people, Torres, but accuracy saves them. When the moment comes, and it will come, you'll know exactly what needs to be done." She had no way of knowing that the moment Colonel Rodriguez had prepared her for would arrive much sooner than anyone expected, or that it would unfold in circumstances so dramatic that it would fundamentally alter not just her own military career, but the way the entire special operations community approached air support coordination training. The woman who had once been dismissed as a career break casualty was about to demonstrate that some skills don't diminish with time. They simply wait for the right moment to prove their worth. And sometimes, the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person who holds the key to solving the impossible. The morning formation at 0530 confirmed Camila's worst fears about how the next several weeks would unfold. As the 19 trainees lined up in perfect rows on the tarmac, she found herself positioned at the far end of the formation, literally and figuratively on the outside of a group that had already begun to coalesce around shared youth, shared confidence, and shared assumptions about who belonged and who didn't. Lieutenant Colonel David Stone, the program commander, addressed the group with the kind of measured intensity that came from decades of military leadership. He was a man whose presence commanded immediate attention, his uniform bearing the ribbons and badges that told the story of someone who'd earned his authority through combat experience rather than administrative climbing. "Welcome to the most demanding air support coordination training in the world," Stone announced, his voice carrying easily across the humid morning air. "Over the next 12 weeks, you will learn to be the critical link between ground forces in contact and the most sophisticated air power on the planet. Some of you will excel, some of you will struggle, and some of you will discover that this calling simply isn't meant for you. His eyes swept across the formation, pausing briefly on each trainee. When his gaze reached Camila, she thought she detected something different from the dismissive looks she'd been receiving. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps a withholding of judgment that felt like a small victory. "The margin for error in this job is 0, Stone continued. A miscommunication, a delayed response, or a failure to maintain composure under pressure doesn't just mean a failed exercise. In the real world, it means American soldiers die. If any of you aren't prepared for that level of responsibility, speak to your instructors today about alternative career paths." Captain Cross stepped forward to take over the briefing, and immediately the tone shifted from Stone's measured professionalism to something that felt more like a challenge specifically designed to weed out weakness. "Today, we begin with basic air-ground communication protocols," Cross announced. "This is foundational material that every competent JTAC must master before we move on to more advanced coordination techniques. For some of you, this will be a review. For others," his gaze lingered on Camila just long enough for everyone in the formation to notice the implication. The first practical session took place in a classroom filled with sophisticated communication equipment and large screen displays showing various aircraft configurations and weapon systems. Each trainee was assigned to a workstation equipped with multiple radios, digital displays, and reference materials that looked nothing like the equipment Camila had used during her previous military service. The exercise seemed straightforward enough. Establish radio contact with a simulated aircraft, relay target information using standard NATO protocols, and coordinate a theoretical precision strike. But the moment Camila sat down at her assigned workstation, she realized how much the technology had evolved during her 6-year absence. The radio interface was completely digital, controlled through touchscreen menus that bore no resemblance to the analog controls she remembered. The mapping system integrated GPS coordinates with real-time satellite imagery in ways that would have seemed like science fiction during her earlier service. Even the standardized communication protocols had been updated with new terminology and procedures she'd never encountered. As she fumbled through the initial setup procedures, trying to navigate unfamiliar menu systems while her younger classmates moved through the same processes with casual familiarity, she became acutely aware of the whispered comments and sideways glances from nearby workstations. "Does someone need a tutorial on how to turn on a radio?" Specialist Kevin Park muttered loud enough for half the classroom to hear, earning quiet snickers from his neighbors. "Maybe we should get Sergeant Torres a printed manual," Staff Sergeant Amanda Foster added with mock helpfulness. "Something from this decade." The exercise that should have taken 15 minutes stretched to nearly 30 as Camila carefully worked through each step, double-checking her inputs and taking the time to understand the new systems rather than rushing through procedures she didn't fully comprehend. Her methodical approach was born from hard-earned wisdom about the importance of getting things right the first time. But in a room full of young trainees eager to demonstrate their speed and confidence, it looked like incompetence. Captain Cross made his rounds through the classroom, observing each trainee's performance and making notes on his ever-present clipboard. When his gaze reached Camila's workstation, he stood behind her for what felt like an eternity, watching her navigate through the final steps of the communication protocol. "Torres," he said finally, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet classroom, "this isn't a correspondence course. In real-world situations, speed matters as much as accuracy. Ground forces don't have the luxury of waiting while you figure out which button to push."
The laughter that followed was neither kind nor subtle. Camila felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady as she replied, "Understood, Captain. I'm still familiarizing myself with the current equipment." "That's exactly my concern," Cross responded, making another note on his clipboard. "This equipment has been standard across all services for 3 years. The fact that you're unfamiliar with basic JTAC systems raises questions about your readiness for this program." The afternoon session focused on physical conditioning, and here Camila hoped she might find more solid footing. She'd maintained her fitness during her civilian years, running regularly and staying in shape through a combination of discipline and necessity. Single mothers didn't have the luxury of letting their health slide. But as the group assembled for the conditioning assessment, she realized that fitness standards had evolved as much as the technology.
The younger trainees moved through obstacle courses and endurance challenges with the kind of explosive energy that seemed impossible to maintain. They attacked each exercise with competitive intensity, turning every event into an opportunity to establish dominance within the group hierarchy. Camila's approach was steady, sustainable, focused on completion rather than domination. She finished every exercise within the required time standards, met every benchmark, and never fell behind the group's pace. But in a competitive environment where being adequate was often interpreted as being inadequate, her solid performance looked unremarkable next to the flashy athleticism of her classmates. "Not bad for someone's mom," Marcus Webb commented as they finished the final exercise, a comment that drew appreciative laughs from several nearby trainees. Maybe there's hope yet. That evening in the dining facility, the social dynamics of the training group crystallized in ways that made Camila's isolation complete. The younger trainees naturally clustered together at tables where conversation flowed easily between discussions of weekend plans, shared military experiences, and the kind of casual camaraderie that develops between people who see themselves as fundamentally similar. Camila sat alone, listening to fragments of conversation from nearby tables that were clearly intended for her to overhear. "Someone's treating this like summer camp," one voice announced with theatrical volume. "Probably here for the steady paycheck and benefits. Easy retirement plan if you can fake it long enough. I heard she's been out for 6 years. Might as well be starting from scratch." The cruelest cut came from a conversation she couldn't help but overhear between Kevin Park and two other trainees who'd positioned themselves at a table directly behind her. $20 as she washes out within the first month, Park declared with the confidence of someone making a sure bet. "I'll take that action, but I say 2 weeks. She'll never make it past the first major exercise. Someone should just tell her that air support coordination isn't like coordinating carpools," followed by the kind of laughter that was designed to wound rather than amuse. One night, Camila called her brother Miguel from the privacy of the base chapel, one of the few places she could find solitude after hours. Her voice barely rose above a whisper as she shared her doubts and fears with the one family member who'd always understood her drive to serve. "Maybe I'm kidding myself, Miguel. Maybe I really am too old for this world. Everything has changed so much since I was active duty. The technology, the culture, the expectations. I feel like I'm constantly one step behind." Miguel's voice came through clearly despite the distance, carrying the kind of steady reassurance that had helped her through the darkest days after her husband's death. "Mila, you survived 6 years as a single mother while working 2 jobs and keeping Diego on the right path. You think a bunch of kids playing soldier are tougher than that challenge?" As she ended the call and walked back towards the dormitory, Camila wondered if her brother truly understood what she was facing. These weren't just kids playing soldier. They were competent, confident, and genuinely skilled at what they did. Their dismissal of her wasn't entirely based on prejudice. It was based on observable performance gaps that she was struggling to close. What none of them could see was how she spent her nights after lights out, studying technical manuals by the dim glow of her phone screen, reviewing communication protocols until they had them memorized, and practicing coordination procedures in her head until they became second nature. While her classmates slept, she was working to bridge the gap between her old knowledge and the new reality of modern air support operations. She wasn't just trying to catch up to their level, she was preparing to exceed it in ways they couldn't imagine.
3 weeks into the program, the harassment had evolved from casual mockery into something more systematic and deliberate. What had begun as offhand comments about Camila's age and perceived incompetence had transformed into a coordinated campaign of exclusion that touched every aspect of her training experience. It started with small things that could easily be dismissed as coincidence or oversight. Her name would mysteriously disappear from study group rosters that had been posted the night before. Equipment she had signed out for training exercises would be returned to the supply room by helpful classmates who claimed they were doing her a favor. Her assigned seat in the classroom would be occupied when she arrived, forcing her to sit in the back where she had to strain to see the instructional displays. The psychological impact of these microaggressions was more exhausting than any physical training requirement. Each day brought a new test of her resilience as she navigated an environment where her presence was treated as an inconvenience at best and a liability at worst.
The most insidious aspect of the harassment was how carefully it was orchestrated to avoid crossing any lines that would trigger official intervention. Captain Cross and his staff maintained plausible deniability about the hostile environment, while the trainees had learned to express their contempt through actions that could be explained away as misunderstandings or accidents. During a particularly challenging exercise involving multi-aircraft coordination, Camila found herself partnered with three of her most vocal critics, Kevin Park, Amanda Foster, and a newer arrival named James Sullivan, who had quickly aligned himself with the group's anti-Camila sentiment. The exercise required coordinating close air support for a simulated ground assault, with each team member responsible for different aspects of the complex operation. Park had appointed himself team leader without consultation, immediately assigning Camila to what he called support functions, essentially making her responsible for maintaining equipment logs and monitoring radio frequencies, while the others handled the actual coordination tasks. When she attempted to contribute tactical suggestions based on her understanding of ground force requirements, she was quickly shut down. Torres, your job is to keep track of our equipment and let us know if any frequencies go dead, Park announced with the kind of condescending patience usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to children. Leave the actual coordination to people who understand current procedures. The exercise proceeded predictably poorly. Park's overconfidence led him to request air support configurations that were technically unsound, while Foster's attempts to manage multiple aircraft at the same time resulted in dangerous congestion in the target area. Sullivan, eager to impress his new allies, made communication errors that would have resulted in friendly fire incidents in a real combat situation. From her relegated position as equipment monitor, Camila could see every mistake as it unfolded. The coordinates Park was transmitting were off by nearly 15 meters, close enough to accomplish the mission objectives, but far enough to cause unnecessary collateral damage. Foster was directing two different aircraft to occupy the same airspace at altitudes that violated basic safety protocols. Most critically, Sullivan was using incorrect authentication codes that would have caused any competent pilot to abort the mission rather than risk attacking friendly positions. "Excuse me," Camila said quietly, raising her hand to get Park's attention. "I think there might be issues with our coordinate calculations and the altitude assignments for the second wave." Park didn't even turn around from his position at the primary communication station. "Torres, I need you to focus on your assigned responsibilities. We don't need backseat coordination from someone who's still learning basic radio procedures." "But the coordinates are going to put ordnance danger close to our own positions," Camila persisted, her voice remaining calm despite the frustration building in her chest. "And if those two A-10s maintain those flight paths, they're going to—" "That's enough," Foster interrupted sharply, finally turning to face her with undisguised irritation. "Kevin is team leader for this exercise. If you can't follow simple instructions about staying in your lane, maybe you need to reconsider whether you belong in this program." The exercise continued with predictable results. The simulation software registered multiple safety violations, mission effectiveness ratings that barely met passing criteria, and coordination errors that would have resulted in mission failure under real-world conditions. But instead of acknowledging the technical problems that Camila had attempted to identify, the team used their poor performance as further evidence of her disruptive influence. "See what happens when you try to accommodate people who aren't ready for this level of training?" Park announced loud enough for nearby teams to hear as they packed up their equipment. "Constant interruptions and second-guessing from someone who doesn't understand the big picture."
Captain Cross appeared at their workstation just as they were completing their post-exercise equipment check, his clipboard ready and his expression suggesting he'd already formed opinions about what he'd observed. "How did Team 4 perform today?" Cross asked, directing his question primarily toward Park, while his eyes swept dismissively over Camila's position at the equipment table. "Challenging exercise, sir," Park replied with practiced military bearing. "We completed all primary objectives, though we did experience some distractions that affected our overall efficiency." Cross made notes on his clipboard while nodding in a way that suggested Park's assessment aligned with his own observations. "Torres," he said without looking at her directly, "I noticed you seem to be having difficulty staying focused on your assigned role during the exercise." "Sir, I was attempting to identify potential safety issues with our coordination sequence," Camila replied carefully, choosing her words to avoid any suggestion of insubordination while still defending her actions. "That's exactly the problem," Cross said, finally making eye contact with her. "Your assigned role was equipment monitoring, not tactical oversight. The inability to stay within your designated responsibilities suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of how military teams function." He closed his clipboard with a decisive snap of someone who'd made up his mind about what he'd witnessed. "Team leadership rotates every week. Next week, Torres, you'll be observing from the control room while more experienced trainees handle primary coordination responsibilities." The words hit like a physical blow. Observer status was essentially academic probation, a clear signal that a trainee was being moved toward program elimination rather than advancement. It meant sitting in a separate room watching exercises on monitors, while others gained the hands-on experience that was essential for JTAC certification. That evening, the dining facility conversations reached new levels of cruelty as word of her observer assignment spread through the trainee population. "I heard Torres got benched," one voice announced with barely contained glee. "Guess they finally figured out she wasn't cut out for the real work." "About time," another voice replied. "Someone was going to get hurt if they kept letting her play with actual communication equipment." "My money's still on 2 weeks," Kevin Park's voice carried clearly from a table across the room. "Observer status is just the polite way of managing her exit from the program." The breaking point came 3 days later during what should have been a routine individual assessment. Each trainee was required to demonstrate basic communication protocols in a one-on-one session with an instructor, essentially proving they could handle fundamental JTAC responsibilities without supervision or assistance. Camila had been assigned to work with Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, whose skepticism about her capabilities had been evident since her first day in the program. The assessment took place in a small room equipped with a single communication station and a large monitor displaying various aircraft and target configurations. "All right, Torres, this is about as basic as it gets. I need you to establish contact with the simulated aircraft on frequency 142.50, relay the target coordinates displayed on your screen, and request a single precision munition on the designated target. Think you can handle that?" The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, but Camila simply nodded and took her position at the communication station. This was the kind of fundamental skill that should have been routine for anyone in the program, the military equivalent of a basic literacy test. But as she reached for the radio controls, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The frequency Webb had specified, 142.50, was displaying active traffic from what appeared to be an actual training exercise happening elsewhere on the base. Real pilots, real aircraft, real coordination happening on a frequency that was supposedly reserved for their simulation. Using that frequency wouldn't just result in a failed assessment, it would potentially interfere with actual air operations and could result in serious safety violations that might affect her security clearance and future military career. "Sergeant Webb," she said carefully, "I'm showing active traffic on 142.50. Should I use an alternative frequency for the simulation?" Webb's expression shifted from bored condescension to irritated impatience. "Torres, the frequency is clearly marked on your instruction sheet. If you can't follow basic directions for a simple assessment, maybe it's time to have a serious conversation about your future in this program." Camila stared at the radio controls, realizing that she was facing a test that went far beyond technical competence. This was a moment that would define not just her assessment results, but her fundamental character as a military professional. The silence in the assessment room stretched for what felt like an eternity. as Camila weighed her options. She could follow Webb's instructions and use the active frequency, potentially interfering with real air operations and demonstrating the kind of dangerous judgment that had no place in military aviation, or she could refuse to follow a direct order from an instructor, effectively ending her career in the JTAC program and confirming every negative assumption her critics had made about her suitability for the role. Sergeant Torres, Webb said, his voice taking on the edge that every military professional recognized as a warning, "I'm waiting for you to begin the assessment. The instructions are clear, and this is not a negotiation." Camila took a deep breath and made her choice, one that would define not just this moment, but everything that followed. "Sergeant Webb, with respect, I cannot use frequency 142.40 because it's currently active with what appears to be live training operations. Using that frequency would violate basic radio discipline and could potentially interfere with actual air support missions." Webb's face flushed red with what appeared to be genuine anger. "Torres, you don't get to rewrite assessment parameters because you think you know better than your instructors. Your job is to follow orders, not to second-guess every direction you receive." "My job is to be a competent joint terminal attack controller," Camila replied quietly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "And competent JTACs don't transmit on active operational frequencies during training exercises." The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Webb terminated the assessment immediately, marking her evaluation as failed to follow instructions and recommending her for immediate program review. Within 2 hours, Camila found herself sitting across from Captain Cross in his office, facing what everyone understood to be a career-ending conversation. "Sergeant Torres," Captain began, consulting the folder of paperwork that had apparently accumulated about her case, "Sergeant Webb has reported that you refused to follow direct instructions during a basic assessment exercise. This follows a pattern of behavior that suggests you're not adapting well to the collaborative requirements of this program." Camila had spent the 2 hours between Webb's office and Cross's preparing for this conversation, knowing that how she handled the next few minutes would determine whether she remained in the military or found herself processing out with a record that would follow her for the rest of her civilian career. "Captain, I respectfully disagree with Sergeant Webb's characterization of what happened during the assessment," she said, maintaining the kind of military bearing that she learned could sometimes bridge the gap between subordinates and superiors when emotions ran high. "I identified a safety issue with the prescribed frequency and attempted to address it in accordance with standard radio protocols." Cross leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting that he'd already made up his mind about the outcome of this conversation. "Sergeant Torres, let me be clear about something. Military training is designed around following orders, even when you don't understand the reasoning behind those orders. Your pattern of questioning instructions and suggesting alternatives indicates a fundamental misunderstanding of military hierarchy. Sir, military training is also designed around developing professionals who can make sound judgments under pressure," Camila replied, knowing she was walking a fine line between defending herself and insubordination. "If we're training JTACs who can't identify potential safety issues, we're not training competent air support coordinators." The confrontation that followed covered familiar ground: her age, her time away from military service, her difficulty adapting to current procedures, and her apparent inability to function effectively within the team environment that modern military operations required. Each point Cross raised felt like another nail in the coffin of her military career. But as the formal counseling session drew toward its inevitable conclusion, something unexpected happened. Lieutenant Colonel Stone appeared in the doorway of Cross's office. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the conversation. "Sergeant Cross," Stone said with the kind of calm authority that made everyone in the room straighten unconsciously, "I need to speak with Sergeant Torres about the frequency issue that came up during today's assessment." Cross looked surprised, but quickly deferred to his superior officer. "Yes, sir. We were just discussing Sergeant Torres's difficulty following assessment protocols." Stone entered the office and closed the door behind him, his expression unreadable as he took the empty chair beside Camila's. "Sergeant Torres, can you walk me through exactly what happened during your assessment with Sergeant Webb?" When she finished, Stone was quiet for a long moment before turning to address Captain Cross. "Captain,
The frequency that Sergeant Webb designated for the assessment was indeed active with live training operations from the 1st Special Operations Wing. If Sergeant Torres had followed his instructions, she would have interfered with actual close air support operations involving real aircraft and real personnel. The color drained from Cross's face as the implications of Stone's statement became clear. "Sir, I wasn't aware that—" "Of course you weren't aware," Stone interrupted, but his tone suggested professional correction rather than personal criticism. But Sergeant Torres was aware, and she made the correct decision to prioritize operational safety over assessment compliance. The silence that followed felt charged with implications that extended far beyond Camila's individual situation. She realized she was witnessing a moment when assumptions were being challenged and hierarchies were being forced to confront uncomfortable realities about competence and judgment. Stone turned back to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Sergeant Torres, your response during today's assessment demonstrates exactly the kind of tactical thinking and safety awareness that we need in JTAC operations. The ability to identify potential problems and make sound decisions under pressure is more valuable than the ability to follow instructions without question." Cross shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly processing the reversal of what he'd assumed would be a straightforward disciplinary action. "Sir, Sergeant Torres has had ongoing difficulties with team integration and following standard procedures." "Captain," Stone said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority, "I think we need to examine whether the difficulties Sergeant Torres has experienced reflect problems with her performance or problems with how we've been evaluating her performance." The conversation that followed transformed Camila's understanding of her entire experience in the program. Stone revealed that he'd been quietly monitoring her progress, not because he doubted her capabilities, but because he'd noticed discrepancies between her demonstrated knowledge and her official performance evaluations. "I've reviewed your background, Sergeant Torres," Stone said, consulting a folder that appeared to contain significantly more information than the disciplinary paperwork Cross had been working from. "Your previous military service included some specialized training that isn't reflected in your current program file. Would you like to explain why that training isn't being considered in your current evaluations?" This was the moment Camila had been both dreading and hoping for since her arrival at Eglin, the moment when she would either reveal a classified training that could transform her standing in the program, or continue to allow others to underestimate her capabilities while she struggled through assessments that tested skills she'd mastered years earlier. Looking directly at Lieutenant Colonel Stone, she made the decision that would change everything. "Sir, 8 years ago, I was selected for Colonel Samuel Rodriguez's Advanced Combat Coordination Program. The training I received in that program included techniques and procedures that go significantly beyond standard JTAC certification requirements." Stone's eyebrows rose slightly, the first sign of surprise she'd seen from him during the entire conversation. "Ghost Rodriguez's program? I thought that was still classified." "It was declassified last year, sir, though most of the specific techniques remain restricted. Colonel Rodriguez made me promise not to discuss the training unless it became necessary for operational reasons." Cross looked completely lost, clearly unfamiliar with the program they were discussing. "Sir, I'm not aware of any specialized training in Sergeant Torres's file." "Because it wouldn't be in her standard personnel file. Colonel Rodriguez's program was a special access program that involved techniques and capabilities that most military personnel never encounter." Stone turned back to Camila with an expression that had shifted from polite professional interest to genuine curiosity. "Sergeant Torres, if you received Rodriguez's advanced training, why have you been struggling with basic JTAC procedures?" "I haven't been struggling with the procedures, sir," Camila replied quietly. "I've been struggling with equipment and protocols that are different from what I learned years ago, while trying not to reveal capabilities that might be seen as showing off or undermining my instructors." The room fell silent as both officers processed the implications of what she'd just said. Camila realized she'd reached the point of no return. Either her revelation would transform her situation, or it would create new problems that might prove even more difficult to navigate than the ones she'd been facing. Lieutenant Colonel Stone leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to intense interest. The casual authority he'd maintained throughout the conversation was replaced by the focused attention of someone who'd just encountered something unexpected and potentially significant. Sergeant Torres, he said carefully. Colonel Rodriguez's program was legendary within special operations circles. If you're telling me you were selected for that training, I need to understand why none of that background is reflected in your current performance evaluations or program standing. Camila took a deep breath, realizing that the next few minutes would determine not just her immediate future in the JTAC program, but potentially her entire military career trajectory. For months, she'd been hiding her most valuable qualifications in an attempt to fit in with her younger, less experienced classmates. The irony wasn't lost on her that her greatest strength had become her most carefully guarded secret. Sir, Colonel Rodriguez's training focused on what he called crisis coordination, managing air support in situations where normal procedures break down and standard protocols become inadequate. She began, choosing her words carefully to respect the classified nature of much of what she'd learned while still explaining her capabilities. The program operated under the assumption that conventional JTAC training, while excellent for routine operations, didn't adequately prepare coordinators for scenarios where multiple aircraft, complex terrain, and rapidly changing tactical situations created coordination challenges that couldn't be solved through standard procedures. Captain Cross shifted uncomfortably, clearly out of his depth in a conversation that had moved far beyond his area of expertise. Sir, I'm still not understanding how this relates to Sergeant Torres's difficulties with basic program requirements. Because they weren't difficulties, Captain, Stone interrupted, his voice carrying a note of realization. They were adaptations. Sergeant Torres has been trying to use advanced techniques to accomplish basic tasks like using a precision instrument for routine measurements. Stone turned his full attention back to Camila. Tell me about the coordination scenarios Rodriguez had you work through. The memories came flooding back as Camila began to describe training exercises that had pushed her far beyond anything she'd encountered in conventional military instruction. Rodriguez had created simulation scenarios involving simultaneous coordination of up to 12 aircraft across multiple mission types, close air support, medical evacuation, supply drops, and reconnaissance, all happening in the same airspace and time frame. She called it tactical chaos management. The idea was that real combat doesn't follow the clean sequential procedures we practice in training. In actual operations, you might have A-10s providing close air support while medevac helicopters are trying to extract wounded personnel, supply aircraft are attempting drops to forward positions, and reconnaissance platforms are gathering intelligence, all at the same time, all in the same general area. She paused, remembering the intensity of those training sessions in the Nevada desert, where Rodriguez had pushed her and the other selected candidates through scenarios that seemed impossibly complex until they suddenly became manageable through techniques that transcended standard protocols. The traditional approach teaches sequential coordination. Handle one aircraft at a time, complete one mission before beginning another, maintain clear separation between different types of operations, she continued. Rodriguez's method taught simultaneous coordination using what he called predictive flow management, essentially anticipating the movement and requirements of multiple aircraft, while managing them as components of a single, integrated operation rather than separate individual missions. Stone was taking notes now, clearly recognizing the significance of what she was describing. How many people completed Rodriguez's program? 12, sir, out of 120 candidates who started the selection process. And how many of those 12 are still in active service? Camila's expression grew somber. 3, sir. Colonel Rodriguez retired 4 years ago, and most of the program graduates either left the military or moved into positions where their specialized training wasn't directly applicable to their duties. The weight of that information settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Stone and Cross both seemed to be processing the implications of having someone with such rare and specialized training struggling through a basic JTAC certification program. Sergeant Torres, Stone said finally, can you give me a specific example of how Rodriguez's training differs from standard JTAC procedures?
Rodriguez taught us to think in terms of coordination webs instead of linear sequences. While establishing contact with one aircraft, we'd simultaneously be calculating optimal approach vectors for follow-on missions, identifying potential complications from weather or terrain changes, and preparing contingency plans for multiple possible scenarios. She pulled out her notebook and began sketching a diagram that showed the difference between sequential coordination and simultaneous management. Instead of managing one aircraft from contact to engagement completion,
We learned to manage multiple aircraft through overlapping phases of their missions, so that as one was completing engagement, another was beginning approach, a third was receiving targeting data, and a fourth was being positioned for potential follow-on missions. Cross studied the diagram with growing understanding. So, when you were taking extra time during our early exercises, I was calculating optimal positioning for aircraft that weren't even part of the immediate scenario, Camila finished. Rodriguez's training created habits of comprehensive situational awareness that made simple exercises feel incomplete, because I was accounting for variables that weren't present in the simulations. Stone closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Sergeant Torres, I need to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer. Given your background and training, how would you assess the capabilities of your current classmates? It was the question Camila had been dreading, because answering honestly might sound arrogant, while answering diplomatically wouldn't serve anyone's interests. She chose honesty. Sir, my classmates are competent at standard procedures, and they learn quickly. But they're being trained to handle routine coordination tasks, not crisis management. If they encountered the kind of complex scenarios that Rodriguez prepared us for, most of them would be overwhelmed within the first few minutes. And how do you think you'd perform in those same complex scenarios? I'd handle them, sir. That's what I was trained to do. The confidence in her voice surprised everyone in the room, including herself. For months, she'd been questioning her own capabilities and wondering if she'd lost the edge that had once made her exceptional. But talking about Rodriguez's training reminded her of who she'd been before civilian life had made her doubt her professional competence. Stone stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the training ranges where aircraft were conducting the kind of routine exercises that had become the measuring stick for GTAC competence. When he turned back to face her, his expression had changed completely. Sergeant Torres, I'm going to ask you to do something that might be uncomfortable, but I think it's necessary for everyone involved in this program, he said. Tomorrow morning, we're conducting a major multi-aircraft exercise involving Delta Force personnel, multiple fighter aircraft, and helicopters. It's designed to be the most challenging coordination scenario our trainees will face before graduation. He paused, making sure he had her full attention. I want you to serve as the primary coordinator for that exercise, not as an observer, not as an assistant, but as the lead JTAC responsible for managing the entire operation. Cross looked alarmed. Sir, Sergeant Torres hasn't completed the prerequisite training modules for that level of responsibility. Captain, Sergeant Torres completed training modules that don't exist in our current curriculum, Stone replied firmly. It's time we found out whether Colonel Rodriguez's methods produce the kind of tactical coordinators our Special Operations Forces actually need. He turned back to Camila with an expression that mixed challenge and opportunity in equal measure. Sergeant Torres, are you prepared to demonstrate capabilities that go beyond what anyone in this program has seen before? Looking directly into Stone's eyes, Camila felt something awakening inside her that had been dormant since her return to civilian life. The confidence, the tactical instincts, and the absolute certainty that had made her one of Rodriguez's most successful graduates. Yes, sir, I'm ready. What none of them could anticipate was that the exercise Stone had in mind would create exactly the kind of crisis scenario that Rodriguez had spent years preparing her to handle, and that her response would not only vindicate her training, but transform how the entire special operations community approached air support coordination. The pre-dawn briefing room at Eglin Air Force Base buzzed with the controlled energy that preceded major training exercises. Representatives from multiple units had gathered for what was officially designated as Exercise Thunderstrike, a complex multi-phase operation designed to test coordination between Special Operations ground forces and various aircraft in scenarios that push the boundaries of conventional training. Camila sat in the front row, acutely aware that every eye in the room was focused on her with mixtures of curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed hostility. Word had spread quickly through the trainee population that the problem student, who'd been relegated to observer status, was somehow being given primary responsibility for the most challenging exercise of the entire program. Lieutenant Colonel Stone took position at the front of the briefing room, his presence immediately commanding the attention of the 40-plus personnel who would be involved in various aspects of the day's operations. Behind him, large screen displays showed aerial photographs of the training area, aircraft specifications, and timeline charts that illustrated the complexity of what they were attempting. Today's exercise involves coordination of 12 different aircraft across 4 different mission types, Stone announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the significance of what they were attempting. We have 2 A-10 Thunderbolts providing close air support, 4 F-16 Fighting Falcons conducting precision strikes, 3 UH-60 Blackhawks managing personnel insertion and extraction, 2 CH-47 Chinooks handling supply operations, and 1 MQ-9 Reaper providing reconnaissance and surveillance. The specifications alone were enough to make experienced coordinators nervous. Managing 12 aircraft simultaneously required tracking multiple communication frequencies, coordinating flight paths through shared airspace, sequencing attacks and support operations to avoid conflicts, and maintaining real-time awareness of ground force positions and requirements. The ground element consists of 2 Delta Force teams conducting separate but related objectives, Stone continued, advancing to the next briefing slide. Team Alpha will be securing a high-value target compound, while Team Bravo simultaneously conducts hostage rescue operations approximately 2 kilometers away. Both teams will require close air support, medical evacuation capabilities, and supply-resupply, all within a compressed time frame. Captain Cross, who had been relegated to observer status for this exercise, raised his hand with obvious concern. Sir, managing 12 aircraft across dual ground operations typically requires a minimum of 3 qualified JTACs working in coordination. Having a single coordinator handle this level of complexity seems like the kind of scenario our special operations forces encounter in actual combat situations. Captain, the enemy doesn't coordinate their activities to accommodate our training limitations. Real operations often require individual coordinators to handle complexity that exceeds our current training standards. Stone's eyes found Camila in the front row. Sergeant Torres, you'll be positioned at Coordination Station Alpha with full communication access to all aircraft and ground elements. Your mission is to manage all air support requirements for both ground teams while maintaining safety protocols and operational effectiveness. The silence that followed was profound. Even the most confident trainees in the program had never attempted coordination of more than 4 aircraft simultaneously, and the idea of managing 12 aircraft across dual operations was beyond anything they had encountered in their most challenging exercises. Marcus Webb, who'd been assigned as backup coordinator, leaned forward with undisguised skepticism. Sir, no disrespect to Sergeant Torres, but this level of complexity requires experience with advanced coordination protocols that aren't covered in standard JTAC training. If she's not familiar with multi-aircraft sequencing procedures, Sergeant Torres will be using coordination procedures that go beyond standard training. Your job as backup coordinator is to monitor her performance and be prepared to assume primary responsibility if requested. Stone advanced to the final briefing slide, which showed the timeline for the exercise. Exercise commencement at 0800 hours. Ground teams insert via helicopter at 0815 hours. First air support requests anticipated by 0830 hours. Exercise conclusion no later than 1100 hours. Questions? Kevin Park raised his hand with the aggressive confidence that had characterized his attitude toward Camila since her arrival. Sir, what happens if the primary coordinator becomes overwhelmed by the complexity? Do we have abort procedures if the exercise becomes unsafe?
Stone's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a note of steel. Private Park, the only thing that makes this exercise unsafe is coordinators who panic under pressure or doubt their own capabilities. Professional JTACs don't abort missions because they're challenging. As the briefing concluded and personnel began moving toward their assigned positions, Camila found herself walking alone toward Coordination Station Alpha. The isolation she'd experienced throughout her training had intensified now that she was about to attempt something that everyone believed was beyond her capabilities. The coordination station occupied an elevated position overlooking the training area, equipped with multiple radio systems, digital displays showing aircraft positions and ground team locations, and communication links that would allow her to maintain contact with all elements of the complex operation. As she familiarized herself with the equipment layout, she felt the familiar calm settling over her that had always preceded Rodriguez's most challenging exercises. Master Sergeant Carol Reed, the senior enlisted advisor who'd been quietly supportive throughout Camila's struggles, approached the coordination station with an expression of concern mixed with curiosity. Torres, Reed said quietly, positioning herself so their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the observers gathering in nearby positions. I don't know what kind of background you have that convinced Stone to put you in this position, but I need you to understand something. If this exercise goes badly, it won't just end your career. It could affect funding and support for this entire program. Camila met Reed's eyes directly, appreciating both the warning and the underlying concern for her well-being. Master Sergeant, I understand the stakes. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't confident in my ability to handle what they're asking me to do. Reed studied her face for a moment, seeming to search for signs of false bravado or dangerous overconfidence. Whatever she saw must have been reassuring because she nodded once and stepped back. Good luck, Torres. Show them what you're made of. At 0800 hours precisely, Stone's voice crackled over the communication system. Exercise Thunderstrike is now active. All aircraft and ground elements are cleared to begin operations. Within minutes, Camila's radio systems began coming alive with the coordinated chaos that defined complex military operations. Ground teams reported their insertion status, while aircraft called in for guidance on approach vectors and engagement parameters. The carefully orchestrated timeline immediately began experiencing the kind of complications that turned theoretical exercises into tests of practical competence. Coordinator, this is Razor 11, came the first request, the voice of the A-10 pilot sharp with professional urgency. Ground Team Alpha is reporting enemy contact and requesting immediate close air support. We're 3 minutes out and need targeting information. Before Camila could respond to the first request, her communications board lit up with additional calls. Coordinator, Dustoff 7-3 requesting clearance for medical evacuation approach to Team Bravo location. We have wounded personnel requiring immediate extraction. Simultaneously, another voice cut through. Coordinator, Cargo 24 requesting guidance on supply drop coordinates. Ground Team Alpha is reporting critically low ammunition. Within 30 seconds of exercise commencement, Camila found herself facing exactly the kind of scenario that Rodriguez had prepared her to handle. Multiple urgent requirements demanding immediate attention with no clear priority sequence and no possibility of handling them one at a time. The observers watching from nearby positions expected to see her become overwhelmed by the rapid succession of requests. Instead, they witnessed something that none of them had encountered before: a coordinator who didn't just manage multiple simultaneous requirements, but seemed to orchestrate them as components of a single integrated operation. Razor 11, proceed to holding pattern at Angels 15, bearing 270 from target Alpha, Camila transmitted with calm precision while simultaneously reviewing medical evacuation requirements and supply drop coordinates. Dustoff 7-3, you're cleared for approach to Team Bravo LZ. Maintain altitude 500 feet. Be advised you have close air support operating in adjacent area. Cargo 24, delay supply drop until close air support completes engagement, approximately 4 minutes. What the observers couldn't see was that Camila wasn't just responding to individual requests, she was calculating the optimal sequence for all operations, while maintaining real-time awareness of how each element's actions would affect every other element's requirements and safety. The exercise that was supposed to test the limits of coordination capability had become a demonstration of coordination techniques that exceeded anything in standard military training, and it was only the beginning. As the exercise intensified, what had started as a complex but manageable training scenario began spiraling into something that resembled actual combat conditions more than controlled military instruction. The carefully planned timeline that had looked challenging on paper disintegrated within the first 15 minutes as real-world complications cascaded through every aspect of the operation. Coordinator, this is Team Alpha Actual. The voice of the Delta Force team leader crackled through with urgent intensity. We've encountered unexpected resistance at the target compound. Enemy personnel are using human shields. We need precision close air support, but danger close restrictions apply. Friendlies are within 50 meters of target structures. Before Camila could respond to that critical update, additional complications began piling up with relentless speed. Coordinator, Dustoff 7-3, declaring emergency approach. We have a critical patient aboard who won't survive delayed medical evacuation. Requesting immediate clearance to primary medical facility. Simultaneously, another crisis emerged. Coordinator, Razor 1-2 experiencing hydraulic failure. Aircraft is losing maneuverability and may need emergency landing clearance at alternate airfield. The observers watching from their elevated positions had gone silent, recognizing that the exercise had evolved beyond anything they had encountered in their training experience. Captain Cross looked pale as he realized that the scenario he'd considered impossibly complex had become genuinely dangerous, with aircraft malfunctions and time-critical medical situations that couldn't be paused or reset like normal training exercises. But Camila's response to the cascading emergencies demonstrated exactly why Rodriguez had selected her for advanced training. Instead of becoming overwhelmed by the rapid succession of critical decisions, she seemed to enter a state of enhanced clarity, where every element of the complex operation became part of a single, manageable flow. Razor 1-2, proceed directly to alternate landing strip at bearing 095, distance 12 nautical miles. She transmitted with calm precision while simultaneously calculating the implications of losing one aircraft for the close air support requirements of both ground teams. Emergency crews are being notified. Maintain current altitude and report any changes in aircraft status. Without pausing, she shifted to addressing the medical evacuation crisis. Dustoff 7-3, you're cleared for direct route to primary medical facility. Climb to altitude 1,500 feet to clear all other air traffic. Medical personnel have been alerted to your approach and critical patient status. The most challenging decision involved Team Alpha's request for danger-close air support, with human shields complicating the targeting requirements. This was exactly the kind of scenario where Rodriguez's training proved invaluable, situations where standard procedures provided no clear guidance, and coordinators had to rely on judgment, experience, and tactical instincts. Team Alpha Actual, understand your danger-close requirements with civilian considerations. Camila responded, her voice maintaining the steady professionalism that was keeping the entire operation coherent. Razor 1-1, adjust to precision targeting configuration. Team Alpha, I need exact coordinates for friendly positions and detailed description of target structure layout. What the observers witnessed next was something none of them had seen before, a coordinator managing multiple simultaneous emergencies, not as separate problems requiring individual solutions, but as interconnected elements of a single operation that could be optimized through careful sequencing and resource allocation. While guiding the damaged aircraft to safety and expediting medical evacuation, Camila was simultaneously coordinating with Team Alpha to develop a precision strike solution that would neutralize the target without endangering civilians or friendly forces. She directed one of the F-16s to provide overhead reconnaissance, while another prepared for a precision munitions strike, all while ensuring that supply aircraft remained clear of the engagement zone and that Team Bravo's separate operation continued without interference. Coordinator, this is Razor 1-1, the A-10 pilot reported, his voice tight with the concentration required for danger-close operations. I have visual on target structure. Civilian personnel visible in adjacent buildings. This shot is going to require precision beyond standard close air support parameters.
Razor 1-1 understood.
Camila replied, her response demonstrating the kind of tactical confidence that could only come from extensive experience with similar scenarios. Adjust approach vector to bearing 285. Delay engagement until Team Alpha repositions to provide laser designation. Window for engagement will be approximately 30 seconds. The coordination she was managing required split-second timing across multiple aircraft and ground elements, with margin for error measured in meters and seconds, rather than the generous safety buffers that characterized normal training exercises. Yet her communications remained calm, precise, and confident, providing the kind of steady leadership that allowed everyone involved in the operation to perform at their highest capability levels. Team Alpha, reposition laser designator to target building northeast corner, she directed, while simultaneously monitoring the progress of medical evacuation and emergency landing operations. Razor 1-1, begin your approach when Team Alpha confirms laser designation active. Window for engagement opens in 60 seconds. Master Sergeant Reed, watching from the observer position, turned to Lieutenant Colonel Stone with undisguised amazement. "Sir, I've never seen anyone coordinate this level of complexity without losing situational awareness or making critical errors. How is she tracking all these moving pieces simultaneously?" Stone's expression had shifted from professional interest to genuine awe as he watched Camila manage what had become a genuine test of advanced coordination capabilities. "She's not just tracking them, Master Sergeant. She's orchestrating them. Every decision she's making optimizes the overall operation rather than just solving individual problems." The critical moment arrived as all elements of the complex operation converged simultaneously. The damaged aircraft was approaching emergency landing while the medical evacuation helicopter was racing toward the hospital with its critical patient. Team Alpha had repositioned for laser designation, while the A-10 was beginning its precision approach for a danger-close strike that required perfect coordination between pilot, ground team, and coordinator. "All stations, this is coordinator. Razor 1-2, you're cleared for emergency landing. Medical teams are standing by. Dustoff 7-3, you're cleared for priority approach to medical facility. Razor 1-1, you're cleared hot for precision engagement. Team Alpha, maintain laser designation until ordnance impact." The next 30 seconds would test every aspect of the coordination techniques Rodriguez had taught her. Multiple aircraft operating in shared airspace, time-critical operations happening simultaneously, and human lives depending on split-second timing and flawless communication. The observers held their breath as they watched the most complex coordination scenario any of them had ever witnessed unfold in real time. What they saw was something that redefined their understanding of what individual coordinators could accomplish under pressure. The precision strike eliminated the target with surgical accuracy while avoiding any harm to civilians or friendly forces. The damaged aircraft landed safely at the alternate airfield with emergency crews standing by. The medical evacuation helicopter delivered its critical patient to hospital personnel who were prepared and waiting. But beyond the successful completion of individual elements, what impressed the observers most was the seamless integration of all operations. Nothing had been delayed, compromised, or sacrificed to accommodate other requirements. Every element of the complex operation had been optimized to support overall mission success. As the immediate crisis elements concluded and the exercise returned to more manageable complexity levels, the communications from aircraft and ground teams began reflecting a new tone. Not just professional acknowledgement, but genuine respect for coordination capabilities they'd never encountered before. "Coordinator, this is Team Alpha Actual," came the voice of the Delta Force team leader. "Outstanding coordination on that danger-close engagement. Precision and timing were flawless. Unknown how you managed that level of integration across multiple operations." Similar acknowledgments came from aircraft pilots who'd never experienced coordination that anticipated their needs and optimized their operations rather than simply responding to requests. The exercise had transformed from a test of Camila's capabilities into a demonstration of coordination techniques that exceeded standard military training by significant margins. Lieutenant Colonel Stone keyed his radio to address all participants. "All stations, this is exercise control. Outstanding performance across all elements. Stand by for Phase 2 operations." But what Stone and everyone else were beginning to realize was that they weren't just witnessing successful completion of a challenging exercise. They were seeing capabilities that could transform how Special Operations Forces approached air support coordination in actual combat situations. The immediate aftermath of the crisis coordination created a silence across the exercise area that was more profound than any applause could have been. Aircraft pilots, ground team members, and observers all seemed to be processing what they'd just witnessed. Coordination capabilities that exceeded not just their training experience, but their understanding of what individual coordinators could accomplish under extreme pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Stone was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying over the communication system with something that sounded like genuine amazement. All stations, this is exercise control. Stand down from emergency operations and transition to standard exercise protocol. Outstanding performance by all elements. But as aircraft began returning to routine flight patterns and ground teams resumed their planned objectives, the conversations crackling across various communication frequencies revealed that something fundamental had shifted in how everyone involved perceived air support coordination. Did anyone else see how she managed that precision strike while simultaneously coordinating emergency landing and medical evacuation? Came the voice of one of the F-16 pilots. I've never experienced coordination that anticipated requirements before I even identified them myself. The Delta Force team leader's voice carried a note of professional respect that was unmistakable. Coordinator, this is Team Alpha Actual. Request permission to speak off protocol. In 15 years of special operations, I've never worked with coordination that smooth under pressure. How did you maintain situational awareness across that many simultaneous operations? Before Camila could respond, similar acknowledgments began coming from other elements of the exercise. The medical evacuation pilot, the emergency landing crew, even the supply aircraft that had been held in optimal positions throughout the crisis, all were expressing the kind of professional admiration that experienced military personnel reserved for truly exceptional performance. Captain Cross, who had spent weeks documenting what he perceived as Camila's inadequacies, stood at the observer position with an expression that suggested his entire worldview was being forcibly readjusted. The confident dismissiveness he'd maintained throughout her training had been replaced by something approaching stunned disbelief. "Master Sergeant Reed?" he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. "In your experience, have you ever seen individual coordination of that complexity level?" Reed shook her head slowly, her own expression reflecting the same amazement that was visible on every observer's face. "Captain, I've been involved in air support operations for 22 years. What we just witnessed wasn't just advanced coordination, it was something that changes how you think about what's possible in this job." The technical aspects of what Camila had accomplished were beginning to sink in among the professional observers who understood the challenges involved in complex air operations. Managing 12 aircraft across multiple mission types while handling simultaneous emergencies required not just technical skill, but a level of tactical instinct and situational awareness that couldn't be taught through conventional training methods. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, who had been Camila's most vocal critic throughout her time in the program, approached the coordination station with visible uncertainty. His usual swagger had been replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like humility. "Sergeant Torres," he said, struggling to find words that matched the magnitude of what he'd observed, "I need to apologize for my assessment of your capabilities. What you just accomplished—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't even have a reference point for coordination at that level." Similar apologies and acknowledgments began coming from the trainees who had spent months treating her as dead weight. Kevin Park, who had led much of the mockery about her age and perceived incompetence, stood nearby with an expression that suggested he was re-evaluating every assumption he'd made about military competence and professional capability. "Sergeant Torres," he said, his voice lacking any of the cocky confidence that had characterized his previous interactions with her, "could you explain how you maintain tracking of all those different operations simultaneously? I lost situational awareness just trying to follow your communications." The question opened floodgates of professional curiosity from observers who were beginning to understand that they'd witnessed techniques and capabilities that went far beyond standard military training. Amanda Foster, James Sullivan, and even some of the program instructors began asking detailed questions about coordination methods, decision-making processes, and situational awareness techniques.
But the most significant recognition came from Lieutenant Colonel Stone, who approached the coordination station as the exercise transitioned into its final phase. His expression reflected not just professional admiration, but the kind of strategic thinking that comes from recognizing capabilities that could have broader implications for military operations. Sergeant Torres, Stone said, his voice carrying the weight of command authority mixed with genuine respect, what you just demonstrated represents coordination capabilities that exceed current doctrine for individual JTAC operations. The integration of multiple simultaneous emergencies while maintaining operational effectiveness, he paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. That level of performance suggests training and experience that goes significantly beyond what's reflected in your program file. Camila met his gaze directly, no longer feeling the need to hide her capabilities or downplay her performance to fit in with her classmates' expectations. Sir, Colonel Rodriguez's training focused specifically on crisis scenarios where standard procedures become inadequate. Today's exercise created exactly the kind of conditions that program was designed to address. Stone nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he was processing implications that extended far beyond the immediate training environment. Sergeant Torres, I need you to understand that what happened today is going to generate significant attention from Special Operations leadership. Performance at this level doesn't go unnoticed in our community. The exercise concluded with Camila successfully managing the remaining aircraft through their planned operations while maintaining the same level of precision and integration she demonstrated during the crisis phases. But by that point, the routine coordination tasks seemed almost anticlimactic compared to the emergency management that had redefined everyone's understanding of individual coordinator capabilities. As aircraft returned to base and ground teams completed their objectives, the post-exercise debriefing took on characteristics unlike anything the observers had experienced. Instead of the typical analysis of errors and areas for improvement, the discussion focused on documenting techniques and decision-making processes that exceeded standard training parameters. The precision strike coordination while managing emergency landing and medical evacuations simultaneously, Stone noted during his official debrief, demonstrated integration capabilities that suggest individual coordinators can handle complexity levels we currently assign to multi-person coordination teams. Captain Cross, who had begun the day expecting to document Camila's failure and recommend her removal from the program, found himself instead writing performance evaluations that described capabilities he'd never seen before. His reports would eventually reach senior special operations leadership and contribute to discussions about advanced training methods that could transform air support coordination across multiple military branches. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Master Sergeant Carol Reed, whose quiet support had provided Camila with one of her few positive relationships during the challenging months of training. Reed approached her as the official debriefing concluded, her expression mixing professional admiration with something that looked like genuine pride. Torres, she said quietly, positioning herself so their conversation remained private. In 22 years of military service, I've learned to recognize the difference between people who are competent at their jobs and people who are exceptional at their calling. What you demonstrated today wasn't just professional competence. It was mastery at a level that changes how everyone else thinks about what's possible. She paused, glancing round at the clusters of trainees and instructors who were still discussing various aspects of the exercise. These young soldiers spent months treating you like you didn't belong here. Now they're going to spend years trying to learn techniques that you've already mastered. As Camila packed her coordination materials and prepared to leave the exercise area, she realized that everything had changed in ways that went far beyond personal vindication. The months of isolation, mockery, and professional doubt had culminated in a demonstration that would reshape not just her own military career, but potentially influence how the entire special operations community approached advanced air support training. The woman who had been dismissed as washed up and dead weight had just proven that sometimes the most valuable capabilities are hidden in the most unexpected places. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person who holds the key to revolutionary improvements in how critical military missions are accomplished.
6 weeks after Exercise Thunderstrike, the Joint Terminal Attack Controller training program at Eglin Air Force Base had undergone changes so fundamental that visiting instructors from other military installations barely recognized the curriculum, training methods, or institutional culture that had emerged from what everyone now referred to as the Torres demonstration.
The transformation began within hours of the exercise conclusion, when Lieutenant Colonel Stone received phone calls from senior Special Operations leadership across multiple service branches. Word had spread quickly through military channels about coordination capabilities that exceeded current doctrine, and everyone wanted to understand how a single trainee had managed complexity levels that typically required multi-person coordination teams. The Pentagon is sending a team to review our training methods, Stone announced during the first staff meeting following the exercise. They want to understand whether what Sergeant Torres demonstrated represents individual exceptional capability or indicates that our current training standards are inadequate for modern operational requirements. Captain Cross, whose entire perspective on military training had been transformed by witnessing Camila's performance, raised his hand with obvious uncertainty. Sir, how do we explain that Sergeant Torres was considered a marginal trainee for weeks before demonstrating capabilities that exceed our instructor qualifications? The question exposed uncomfortable truths about how the program had been evaluating competence and potential. Stone's investigation into Camila's training experience revealed systematic bias in performance assessments, inadequate recognition of advanced capabilities, and institutional resistance to coordination methods that differed from standard procedures. We've been training coordinators to follow established protocols rather than develop adaptive capabilities, Stone concluded in his report to higher headquarters. Sergeant Torres' background prepared her for scenarios that our current curriculum doesn't address, which made her advanced techniques appear to be deficiencies rather than superior capabilities. The most significant immediate change was Camila's new role within the program structure. Instead of struggling through basic training modules designed for entry-level coordinators, she was assigned as senior instructor for advanced coordination techniques, with responsibility for developing curriculum that would prepare other trainees for the kind of complex scenarios she'd mastered years earlier. Her first class consisted of the same trainees who had mocked her capabilities just weeks before. Kevin Park, Amanda Foster, James Sullivan, and even Marcus Webb found themselves in the unusual position of learning advanced techniques from someone they'd dismissed as incompetent. The difference between sequential coordination and integrated management, Camila explained during her first formal instruction session, isn't just about handling multiple aircraft simultaneously. It's about understanding how each element's actions create opportunities and constraints for every other element in the operational environment. She used the Thunderstrike exercise as a case study, breaking down the decision-making processes that had allowed her to manage multiple emergencies without compromising any individual operation. When Razor 1-2 reported hydraulic failure, that didn't just create an emergency landing requirement. It removed close air support capability for Team Bravo, required repositioning other aircraft to maintain coverage, and opened a window for expedited medical evacuation that wouldn't have existed with all aircraft maintaining their planned patterns. Park raised his hand with genuine curiosity rather than the confrontational attitude that had characterized his previous interactions with her. Ma'am, how do you calculate all those interdependencies in real time? The mental processing requirements seem impossible for individual coordinators. It's not calculation in the traditional sense, Camila replied, appreciating both the question and the respectful tone that had replaced his earlier dismissiveness. Rodriguez's training developed what he called operational intuition, the ability to feel how changes in one area will affect the entire system. You learn to think in terms of flow and rhythm rather than individual events and responses. The advanced techniques she taught went far beyond standard JTAC procedures, introducing concepts like predictive resource allocation, dynamic priority adjustment, and crisis opportunity recognition that transformed routine coordination into strategic operational management.
Torres is teaching them to think like conductors rather than radio operators, Reed observed to Stone during one of their weekly program reviews. They're learning to orchestrate operations instead of just managing communications. The changes weren't limited to advanced instruction methods. The entire program culture had shifted from competitive individual achievement to collaborative capability development.
The mockery and hazing that had characterized earlier training cycles had been replaced by genuine professional curiosity and mutual support. Webb, who had been among Camila's harshest critics, approached her after class with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal accountability. "Ma'am, I need to acknowledge something that's been weighing on me since the exercise. The way I treated you during your early training was unprofessional and based on assumptions that had nothing to do with your actual capabilities." He paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily. "I've been in military training environments for 12 years, and I've never seen anyone demonstrate the kind of grace under pressure that you showed during those weeks when everyone was doubting your competence. That kind of character isn't something that can be taught." Similar acknowledgments came from other members of the training cadre who had participated or witnessed the systematic dismissal of her capabilities. The program had become a case study in how institutional bias could prevent the recognition of exceptional talent and how transformative leadership could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. But the most significant transformation was in Camila herself. The defensive uncertainty that had characterized her early weeks in the program had been replaced by quiet confidence and natural authority that came from finally being able to demonstrate her true capabilities in an environment that recognized and valued them. "I spent so much energy trying to fit in with everyone else's expectations that I almost forgot what I was actually capable of accomplishing," she confided to Reed during one of their planning sessions for advanced curriculum development. Rodriguez always said that exceptional capabilities require exceptional opportunities to be revealed. "I just never expected the opportunity to come through being underestimated so completely." 3 months after the Thunderstrike exercise, Camila received official notification of her selection for the Advanced Combat Coordination Instructor course, a specialized program that would prepare her to train coordinators for the military's most challenging special operations requirements. The notification came with a personal message from Colonel Samuel Rodriguez himself, who had heard about her demonstration through the special operations community's informal networks. "Torres, I always knew you'd find the right moment to show the world what you learned during our time together, but what impresses me most isn't that you demonstrated exceptional coordination capabilities, it's that you used that demonstration to transform an entire training environment. That's not just tactical expertise, that's leadership at its finest." The message continued. "The military is creating a new Advanced Combat Coordination Institute, and they want someone to head up the Crisis Management Division. Interested? You'd have the opportunity to develop training programs that prepare coordinators for the kind of complex scenarios that conventional training doesn't address." As Camila read the message, she looked around the training facility where her journey had begun with such difficulty and had evolved into recognition that exceeded her highest expectations. The young trainees working through exercises that incorporated her advanced techniques, the instructors who had learned to recognize capability in unexpected forms, the program culture that now valued innovation over conformity, all represented changes that would influence military training for years to come. "Master Sergeant Reed," she said, showing her the message from Rodriguez, "how do you feel about helping develop training programs that will prepare the next generation of coordinators for scenarios we can't even imagine yet?" Reed smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed transformation that went beyond individual achievement. "Torres, I think that's exactly what exceptional capabilities are supposed to accomplish. Not just personal success, but creating opportunities for everyone who comes after." The woman who had arrived at Eglin as a struggling single mother trying to rebuild her military career was leaving as a recognized expert whose methods would influence special operations training across multiple service branches. But more importantly, she had proven that excellence always finds a way to surface, regardless of how many people try to keep it hidden. The transformation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. 2 years after the Thunderstrike exercise that had changed everything, Master Sergeant Camila Torres stood before a packed auditorium at the Pentagon, addressing senior military leadership from all service branches about the evolution of advanced air support coordination training. The same woman who had once been dismissed as dead weight was now presenting findings that would reshape how the United States military prepared coordinators for the most challenging special operations missions.
Traditional JTAC training assumes that coordination complexity can be managed through adherence to established procedures. She explained to an audience that included generals, admirals, and Defense Department officials. But modern combat operations create scenarios where standard procedures become inadequate, and coordinators must rely on adaptive capabilities that transcend conventional training methods. The presentation included video analysis of coordination scenarios from actual combat operations, demonstrating how the techniques developed at Eglin had proven effective in real-world applications. The Advanced Combat Coordination Institute that Camila now directed had trained over 200 coordinators in crisis management techniques, and their performance in subsequent deployments had exceeded all expectations. Lieutenant Colonel Stone, who had been promoted and transferred to Special Operations Planning, watched from the audience with visible pride as his former trainee presented findings that validated his decision to give her the opportunity that had changed everything. The key insight, Camila continued, is that exceptional coordination capabilities aren't just about individual technical skills. They're about developing operational intuition that allows coordinators to understand how complex systems behave under stress and how interventions in one area can optimize performance across entire operational environments. The presentation was being broadcast to military training facilities worldwide, where instructors were learning to recognize and develop advanced capabilities rather than simply teaching adherence to standard procedures. The cultural transformation that had begun at Eglin was now influencing military training across multiple service branches. During the question period that followed, a Navy admiral raised his hand with obvious curiosity. "Colonel Torres, your training methods appeared to produce coordinators who can handle complexity levels that we previously thought required multi-person teams. What are the implications for how we structure air support operations in future conflicts?" The question went to the heart of strategic changes that Camila's work was helping to drive. Individual coordinators trained in advanced techniques could manage operations that previously required coordination teams, allowing military forces to deploy with greater flexibility and reduced communication vulnerabilities. "Sir, the strategic implications are significant," Camila replied, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of proving her capabilities under the most demanding conditions. Coordinators who can manage complex scenarios individually provide commanders with operational options that weren't previously available. But more importantly, they provide redundancy and resilience in situations where communication networks are compromised or coordination teams are separated. After the presentation, Camila found herself surrounded by senior officers who wanted to discuss implementation of advanced training methods at their own facilities. The recognition was gratifying, but what meant more to her was knowing that future coordinators would be prepared for scenarios that would have overwhelmed conventionally trained personnel. That evening, she called her son Diego, who is now finishing his junior year of college and considering his own military service options. Their conversation reflected how much both of their lives had changed since those difficult early days at Eglin. "Mom, I saw the news coverage of your Pentagon presentation. It's hard to believe that 2 years ago you were worried about fitting in with a bunch of kids who didn't recognize your capabilities." "What I've learned," Camila replied, looking out at the Washington skyline from her hotel room, "is that the most valuable capabilities are often hidden in people and places where no one expects to find them. The key is creating environments where those capabilities can be recognized and developed." She had received dozens of messages throughout the day from former trainees, instructors, and military personnel who had been influenced by the changes that began with her demonstration of advanced coordination techniques. Kevin Park had become one of her most successful students and was now training coordinators at Fort Bragg. Marcus Webb had been selected for Special Operations instructor duty and credited his experience with Camila as transformative for his understanding of professional leadership.
But perhaps the most meaningful message had come from Master Sergeant Reed, who was retiring after 24 years of military service and reflecting on the changes she'd witnessed throughout her career.
Torres, Reed's message read, I've seen a lot of transformations during my time in the military, but I've never seen anyone create the kind of systemic change that emerged from your example. You didn't just prove that you belonged, you changed how belonging is defined for everyone who comes after you. The message continued. The young coordinators we're training now will never experience the kind of dismissal and underestimation that you faced because you proved that competence comes in forms that don't always match expectations. That's a legacy that will influence military culture for generations. As Camila prepared for sleep, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a struggling single mother trying to rebuild her career to a recognized expert whose methods were reshaping military training worldwide. The path had been more difficult than anything she could have imagined, but it had also been more rewarding than she dared to hope. The phone rang one final time, and she was surprised to hear the familiar voice of Colonel Samuel Rodriguez, her original mentor, whose training had made everything possible. Torres, Rodriguez said, his voice warm with satisfaction. I just watched your Pentagon presentation online. I knew you'd find the right moment to show the world what you learned during our time together, but I never imagined you'd use that moment to transform how the entire military thinks about advanced coordination training. Colonel, everything I've accomplished builds on the foundation you provided, Camila replied. But I think the most important lesson was one you might not have intended to teach, that exceptional capabilities have a responsibility to create opportunities for others to develop their own excellence. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment before responding. Torres, that's exactly the kind of insight that separates technical experts from transformational leaders. You've proven that the highest form of professional achievement isn't just individual excellence, it's using that excellence to elevate everyone around you. The conversation continued for another hour, covering plans for expanding advanced training programs, developing new techniques for crisis coordination, and creating pathways for other underestimated personnel to demonstrate their hidden capabilities. As the call ended, Camila realized that her story had evolved far beyond personal vindication or career success. She had become part of a larger transformation in how military institutions recognize and develop exceptional talent, regardless of where that talent originates or how it initially presents itself. The woman who had once been called washed up and dead weight was now preparing to brief congressional defense committees about training innovations that would influence military readiness for decades to come. But more importantly, she had created an environment where future generations of military personnel would be evaluated based on their capabilities rather than their conformity to expectations. Her final thought before sleep was about the young coordinators currently progressing through advanced training programs at facilities around the world. Men and women who would never experience the systematic dismissal she'd endured because she had proven that excellence comes in many forms and that the most valuable capabilities are often found in the most unexpected places. The legacy wasn't just about advanced coordination techniques or training innovations. It was about the fundamental principle that competence and character matter more than assumptions and prejudices, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person who holds the key to revolutionary improvements in how critical missions are accomplished. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to develop advanced capabilities in unexpected places, and new chances to prove that the highest form of professional achievement is creating opportunities for others to discover and demonstrate their own hidden potential. The transformation that had begun with a single perfect demonstration under pressure had evolved into a movement that would influence military training for generations to come. And it had all started with a woman who refused to accept that being underestimated meant being limited. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.